Hi, welcome back to GPS, God's Prophetic Surprises. And I should just mention that you may have noticed in the last couple of programs that Shifra Fepuleai has not been with us. And she unfortunately had some other things that took her away. So for the last couple of programs, I am here with Viana Chambers and with Philip Milosavljevic.
Very good.
Almost.
Very good.
Yeah.
Almost
95%. Okay.
Or meatloaf sandwich.
Meatloaf sandwich. That always works.
That works.
My favorite.
And Jon Paulien.
Yes. Yeah.
Just Pauline.
Actually, there is an Italian version. People may know that there's an area called Tyrol, which has been owned by the Austrians, the Germans, and the Italians through the years. It's sort of a borderland.
Oh.
And today, South Tyrol, half of it is in Italy. And it's the famous area called the Dolomites.
Oh.
And so the cities in the Dolomites actually have two names, an Italian name and a German name. And one name you might know is the Council of Trent. Well, the Italian word is Trento.
Oh, okay.
But that's in that Tyrol region. And Bolzano is the equivalent of the German Belsen, and so on. So you have this area that's a little bit of both. But a beautiful mountain setting. How did I get on that?
Paulini.
Oh, yes, that's right. That's right. Because I had an Italian friend back at Andrews University named Paolini.
Yes.
And that is the Italian equivalent of Pauline in the German, or Pauline, or my brother even says Paulien because he wants people to spell it right. So we pronounce it differently.
Good.
But anyway,
good.
Thanks for bringing me back to earth.
Sure. I was
wondering where this was going.
That's right. All right. So last time, in our last program, we were looking at Revelation chapter 10. And verses 8 through 11, and I invite you to be there in your Bibles, and we'll slide over into chapter 11 today. But before we do that, we want to say just a little bit about the disappointment of the Millerites, which was kind of a focus. It seemed that the Millerites, at least, and Seventh-day Adventists today, understand Revelation 10, 8 to 11 to, in a sense, be a prophecy or an anticipation of the Millerite disappointment. And you were going to tell us just a little bit more about that before we move on.
So last time I read a point of reference for us from this text in the historical kind of records of this Millerite movement by a gentleman named Hiram Edson. And he was one of these Millerites that was working with William Miller. And I read to you kind of this end of what happened there on October 22 for this group of people. And he kind of spoke for all of them when he said this. I'm going to reread that just as a reference. Our fondest hopes and expectations were blasted on October 22nd, 1844. And such a spirit of weeping came over us as I had never experienced before. It seemed that the loss of all earthly friends could not have been comparison. We wept and wept till the day of dawn. And so it was this moment of recollection. Wow, Jesus isn't coming. The day is moved on. It's October 23. What happened? And it's in that point that history of Adventist history kind of comes to understanding what Hiram and several others kind of came to a realization of. And I'd like to read to you a little bit more of what happened. So if I can read just a little bit more of what Hiram Edson writes by pen.
And he notice says, he's getting this off his phone. I'm still not reconciled with that, but go ahead.
We'll pray for you.
Yeah, I don't have my computer or anything, otherwise I'd do that. But here he writes of kind of this realization of, hey, this was the wrong event, but the right time, the end of a prophetic time period. But what happened? What actually happened? It wasn't about Jesus coming, but what was it about? And so let me just read this to you. We started, and while passing through a large field, I was stopped about midway of the field. Heaven seemed open to my view, and I saw directly and distinctly clearly that instead of our high priest coming, Jesus, out of the most holy place of the heavenly sanctuary to come to this earth on the 10th day of the 7th month, this end of 2300 days, he, for the first time, entered on that day the second apartment of the sanctuary, and that he had a work to perform in the most holy of places before coming to earth. So it's almost like this idea that, hey, before that seventh trumpet is fully blown, there's a work for God's people, and there's a work for the Lord Jesus Christ himself to do prior to arriving here on earth. So
now, I remember last time, Viana, you said something about a Samuel Snow.
Yeah.
You want to tell us anything about that?
I think I really liked how it tied in with the sweet taste in the mouth verse with the bitterness in the stomach. And he was adamant about preaching this coming of Jesus. And he was so excited telling everyone. And yet, when he didn't come, like there was that like bitterness. And so I was like, man, poor Jon Snow. But I know there's more history than that, but that's kind of what struck out to me in this passage.
Yeah, well, it's a fun story, actually. There was a camp meeting going on, and the Millerites were kind of discouraged because they had an earlier disappointment. Miller originally said Jesus would probably come in the spring of 1844. And it didn't happen, but it was just a general idea. It wasn't saying any particular day. And then in August of 1844, they're having this camp meeting, you know, the big old tent and the sawdust and thousands of people. And somebody's up there just kind of, hang on, guys, you know, Jesus is going to come. I'm sure, you know, he's only delaying for a short time. And Snow comes galloping in on horseback. Stop the meeting, stop the meeting. I have revelation from the Lord, you know.
Wow.
And he came up front and he gave a study in which he showed that it was the Day of Atonement in 1844 was when Jesus would come. And everybody kind of, when is that? And they calculated, and said, October 22.
Yeah.
So that's how that came in only 2 months before.
Oh, wow.
Did anybody ever think in terms of October 22? But that was the Day of Atonement in that year. And they
Jewish
believed
calendar.
that all of this would come together on that day. And even then, as you have read, they were disappointed. You
But I see two stories tying in, and I almost like want to insert myself into like this third, not disappointment, but this pattern of being called to prepare. And both times, I feel like in John's writing and the Millerites, like they thought it was going to be this grandiose witnessing of the end of time, of maybe like the coming of Jesus or the fulfillment of so many of these promises. And yet both times are like, but the time has not come for that. So you still need to go preach. And John kind of talks about that in verse 11. He says, and they said to me, you must prophesy again about many people. And I see the Millerites, you know, turning into the Seventh-day Adventists, doing exactly that, like prophesying again into this. So now when I read that, I'm like, okay, maybe I won't see Jesus coming. So I'm not going to really like put my money in that nest of like, let me just prepare because Jesus might come tomorrow. Versus like, I have a calling here. Like I must prophesy again. And I have so many patterns. I have so many stories that back me up that say, listen, there is a lot of preparation that needs to happen. A lot of people that haven't heard about me. Go.
And you know what? There's even one other disappointment besides the ones you mentioned. Luke 24. We had trusted that he would have been the one who would redeem Israel.
Yeah.
They were talking about Jesus.
Oh, yeah.
Disappointed disciples, disappointed by the cross.
Yeah.
So the original disappointment was at the cross.
I would even say one step further, and it was at the triumphal entry, where, you know, Jesus was marking these times where it was right up, leading up to Passover, and yet they see this country boy, maybe with this country accent, sitting on this donkey, and they said, that's our king? That's the one that, you know, it's been prophesied to us, and I could almost sense like this isn't what we expected. And I feel like that disappointment started even before the cross.
That's a good point. That's a good point, because I think within Jewish expectation, they were looking more at the royal Messiah, the conquering Messiah, the general Messiah, and missing some of the clues in the Old Testament of a suffering element as well. And when Jesus came and lived out the suffering Messiah, that was disappointing. I would say that was a disappointment for the Pharisees, Because for the Pharisees, Messiah was going to be, real big shot in this world. He would come in on a white horse and slay the Romans, and they'd park him on the throne in Jerusalem, and he'd rule the whole world, and so on. And all of that's in the Old Testament.
Yeah, you're
but
right.
not yet. The disappointment was that when the kingdom came, Daniel 2 didn't happen. The other kingdoms didn't get smashed. Now you have the kingdom of God permeating in the world, but the old kingdoms are still here. And that's the surprise. That's the prophetic surprise that they had when Jesus arrived. The kingdom is here, but it wasn't the kingdom as they were expecting.
Oh, interesting.
Wow, we're full of
And
disappointment.
that's a concern, you see, because there's two ways to undo prophecy. One is to not study it at all. The other is to get so excited about it that you elaborate on it and create all kinds of detail so that when the real thing happens, you're disappointed. Or the real thing happens, that can't be it. That's not what our prophetic charts are pointing to. So when Jesus came, he was rejected most by the people who had studied the prophecies, but had done so with such enthusiasm and in such detail that they missed the real thing when it came. So there's dangers on both sides. We're interested in prophecy. That's why we're having this program. You're interested in prophecy. That's why you're watching. But there's a danger, and one of the great dangers is study prophecy by yourself. You get into all kinds of weird things.
It's even
when you
dangerous
do that.
studying it with you, John.
You think so? Ow, that was my bursitis. That's okay. It wasn't too bad.
Oh,
Next time
Vienna.
it'll be to Phil.
Hit
You
my
strike
arm.
lightly. It's okay.
Hit my arm.
Got a little bit of a touch of bursitis here this week, and
You did tell me about
hopefully it will go away in a couple of days. And I'm sorry to
You
embarrass
can hit his
you. It's
arm,
very
man.
cute. Anyway, so yeah, that could be a disappointment too. Good. So you have these Edson and others, and they are seeing that something happened in the heavenly sanctuary. And where'd they get that idea, do you think?
Hebrews and
Studied Hebrews.
also in Daniel a little bit, we have that. So there's this notion that there is a heavenly sanctuary, and modeled from the Old Testament, which is this tabernacle that traveled with them, and they got to experience that, see that, seeing the high priest go from one area to the next, to the most holy place. So.
Read on, Revelation 11. Revelation 11, verses 1 and 2, give us a clue of how the heavenly sanctuary might just have something to do with all this.
Then I was given a measuring rod like a staff, and I was told, "Rise, measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there. But do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out, for it is given over to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. And I will grant authority to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,200 days, clothed in sackcloth."
All right, so there's a temple here in chapter 11. And it's coming right after this disappointment. And so studying all these together, as Edson was walking through the cornfield, suddenly it was kind of like, wait a minute, what about this temple? And what could that be? Now, the question we have to ask is, what temple is this? How do New Testament writers deal with temple, with the concept of temple?
I mean, they had the very temple there in Jerusalem that Solomon had built. And so
Okay.
it's a very glamorous, beautiful temple that unfortunately found its demise there in 70 AD.
Could that be what it's talking about here? Is this the temple in Jerusalem? That's one scholarly approach to this, the temple in Jerusalem. Most scholars would say no, because they believe that Revelation was written after the temple was destroyed. So this wouldn't be talking about the temple in Jerusalem. For the New Testament writers, which was the temple that mattered?
The body?
The body? Okay, can you think of a body temple text?
Your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit.
Okay,
Paul writes.
1 Corinthians
Yeah.
6,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, would they have been? I mean, as the author of Hebrews notes, there is a temple in heaven. Is that what you're?
There's a temple in heaven. Okay, yeah, that's right. Any other temples
The.
in the New Testament now? Any other temples?
I mean, there was the Samaritan temple, right?
There was a Samaritan temple as well, but
Gerizim.
that was destroyed by then. But in the New Testament, there is.
When Jesus says that I will destroy the temple and build it up.
Ooh, okay, yeah, you're on target here. Yes,
Wow, Vienna.
yeah. In John chapter 2. So what's the temple there? Destroy this temple, referring to Herod's
His
temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up. What's he talking about?
His body.
Himself.
Okay.
Himself. All right. So Jesus is the temple.
Okay.
And there's one more that we haven't mentioned yet, and
Come on,
that
Philip,
is
it's on you now.
Oh, brother.
that other one is if you go to 1 Peter, you will see each of you is a living stone in which God is building a temple.
So collectively.
Individual believers are each like a temple stone in that analogy.
Yeah.
You know, you can be a temple and a temple stone, but it's a different analogy.
Sure.
Okay.
So each of us is a temple stone, and God's collectively building us into a temple. And so in 1 Corinthians 3, he says, you are the temple of God. There's a different text than the one you mentioned. You are the temple of God, but it's plural. You can't see that in English. It's you, plural, are the temple of God. Because if you remember in Corinthians, what's the problem in Corinthians?
Pagan worship?
Pagan worship, yeah, I think there was some of that.
There was
But
division amongst
the division
church,
was the big thing. Yeah, the divisions. Some of you follow Peter, and some of you follow Paul, and some of you follow Apollos, and
That's
some of you
right.
say, "Oh, I follow Christ." You know,
Yeah.
those are the really holy ones. You know,
Yeah.
so you have all these divisions, and then he says, "You are the temple of God." But if someone destroys this temple, dividing it up, carving it up, breaking it into pieces, you destroy this temple, God will not look favorably on that. So temple there was the church. So how do you tie all those together? It seems to me you tie them together with Jesus.
Yeah.
If Jesus is really the temple, when he came, the Shekinah glory was housed in himself. So he was the temple. But in the New Testament, the temple is also wherever Jesus is.
Yeah.
Does he reside in human hearts?
Yeah.
Yeah. Does he reside in the heavenly sanctuary?
Yeah.
Yeah. Does he reside in the church?
Yep.
Evidence? Where two or three
are
gather
gathered.
together in my name, I will be in the midst.
Yeah.
All right. So we see that for the New Testament, the literal sanctuary of Herod and Solomon is no longer the big deal. What is the big deal is Jesus himself. He has come. He replaces the temple. He said, where two or three gathered together in my name, I am in the midst. There was actually a Jewish proverb, where two or three come together to study Torah, the Shekinah glory is in their midst.
Oh, wow.
So Jesus sees himself as embodying God's presence in the world. So wherever God's presence goes is going to be a sanctuary. If God dwells in you through the Spirit, that is a body temple. If God dwells in the church, two or three are gathering together, then that is a temple. If Jesus is at the right hand of God, that is a temple. So for the New Testament, temple is Jesus and wherever Jesus is. So the question is, which of those three temples is it here? Let's read the text again.
I'll read it. Then I was given a measuring rod like a staff, and I was told, come and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there. But do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out, for it is given over to the nations, and they will trample over the holy city for 42 months.
Okay, so the first question is this the body temple?
It doesn't seem like it. There's like this physical, division of temple and courtyard and people worshiping
Yeah, unless somebody is a multiple personality, this would probably not be a person. Okay, so we can rule that out. Is this the church? This temple?
It could be.
Could be.
Could be, because it says there's something about the holy. Well, no, it says the holy city will be trampled for 42 months. So there's some physicality to this.
Yeah. Of course,
Yeah,
holy city and temple might not be the same thing.
Yeah.
But you have measured the temple of God, the altar, and those who worship in it. The worshipers would be the church, but they're in the temple.
Right.
So my sense, and scholars divide on this, my sense is that it's not the body temple, it's not the church temple, but it's the heavenly sanctuary.
Okay.
That's in view.
That was my first gut reaction. But
Yeah.
then what kind of follows, like, throws it off a little
The
bit.
trampling down?
Yeah, for 42 months. What is that?
Well, here's the interesting thing. The Mosaic tabernacle was in two sections, and I'll try to do this backwards for the sake of the viewing audience. But over here you have the Ark of the Covenant, and over here you have the altar burnt offering. It's divided into two halves. In the one half you have the tent itself. In the other half you have the outer court. The center of the outer court is the altar burnt offering, representing the cross for Christians. The center of the other half is the ark, representing the throne of God and God's presence, his living presence. So the cross, the living presence, earth, heaven. So the sanctuary, the tent itself represents heavenly things. The altar, the outside altar, the brazen altar, etc., represents earthly things. So
That's the court
if we're going on the
outside the
Mosaic
temple?
tabernacle, the court outside the temple would be on earth. And so the trampling of the holy city, now we have to ask, what is the holy city? That is happening on earth.
Yeah.
So we can get a clue of that, I think, if we go to Luke 21:24.
The suspense is
Luke
killing me.
21:24. Okay, and here it says, "They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led among all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled." Whoa.
So here you have 1,260 days or 42 months of trampling. Luke doesn't give a date,
Yeah.
but he just calls it in general the times of the Gentiles, the trampling of Jerusalem. How would that be understood in the book of Revelation? It seems to me that reflects persecution, because the 1,260 days was a time of persecution. In Revelation 13:5, for 42 months, the beast is persecuting the people of God. And verses 5 through 7, you see here, trampling the holy city. Here's where we get to a very important principle. One of my teachers, Hans Laurendel, used to say, when the New Testament quotes the Old Testament, it takes the literal things of Israel and expands them spiritually and worldwide. So Jerusalem becomes the church. And you can see this in many texts in the New Testament, that the church now, in a sense, takes the place of Jerusalem. The church is an expanded Israel. It has Jews, yes. It has Israelites, yes. But it's bigger. It's got Gentiles and all the rest in there. And so spiritually means that being Israel is not limited to being born of a Jewish mother or born of an Israelite mother. Being Israel means connected to Christ.
Okay.
And the clue for that is the number of Jesus' disciples. Why did he have 12 disciples?
12 tribes of Israel.
12 tribes of Israel.
12.
He saw those disciples, they would be sitting on thrones like the 12 tribes of Israel. So the church, in New Testament thinking, because Messiah has come, the Jewish Messiah has come, this is not anti-Judaism, but it's saying, if the Jewish Messiah has come, then the temple is not so important anymore. The things of Israel are not so important, but the Messiah is the key. And anybody who's in relationship with the Jewish Messiah is now Israel, is spiritually a Jew. So Paul says in Romans 2, the Jew is not so much outwardly as inwardly. That's where the real Jew is.
And so now that is the holy city, like that
Yeah.
entire.
So trampling the holy city would be a parallel to chapter 13, where the beast persecutes the saints. You see? So Israel has become the church. The Gentiles is anyone who is against Jesus and is persecuting the disciples. And so in Acts 4, when they're praying, they take an Old Testament statement about nations coming against Jerusalem, and they say, now right here in Jerusalem, the Gentiles and the people of Israel have conspired against your saints. So they saw themselves as the true saints, the true Jews, and lumped the religious leaders that had been persecuting them with the Romans as Gentiles. So something has crossed here. So you have this very interesting piece that it will predict that in the future these things would happen. Now, what does chapter 11 have to do with chapter 10? Well, here's an important piece. In the original writings of the Bible, there are no chapter divisions.
Right. So they were connected.
There are no verse divisions. There are not even divisions between words. So a lot of that is something that we have to work out and wrestle with as you do Bible translation. So the division between chapter 10 and chapter 11 is an artificial one. It says at the end of chapter 10, prophesy again to many peoples and nations and tongues and kings. And guess who does the prophesying? The two witnesses. In verse 3, you know, these prophesy. Verse 6, these prophets.
I
Verse
thought it
10.
was talking about John, like a command given to John, like
Yeah.
you must prophesy again.
You must prophesy again through the book of Revelation. He will prophesy again. John,
it.
personally, he was 90 years old. So it wasn't so much his life, but it was
Yeah.
talking about his book, which must prophesy again. And so the word prophesy appears multiple times in chapter 11.
Wow.
So everything in chapter 11 is from the perspective of chapter 10, that interpretation, you see? So
So
what
if you
we're
missed
seeing,
chapter 10,
Yeah.
go back and watch all of those episodes and then come back.
that's right. Okay, and you can do that online at, it is LLBN.tv.
It's also on YouTube.
Yes, also on YouTube, so you can find these programs there. So we'll have to close it for now, but the reality is chapter 11 is picking up on the other and indicating that the answer to the disappointment is a new vision of the heavenly sanctuary, that God is going to be doing something in heaven that is going to make all the difference in the final era of Earth's history. As the gospel's preached here, things are closed up there. That's GPS. Thank you again. See you again next week.